Well, there's lots of things going on here in the state of Indiana, whether the sales tax suspension on gasoline for the next 30 days, whether it's $200 million to reopen vouchers for 14,000 kids after the long freeze, but also we got property tax bills that are hitting the mailbox and the broader state financial picture. So with all that, we have our good friend, Michael Hicks, professor of economics at Ball State University. So Michael, my friend, uh, it's never a dull moment. And all that in the primary too. Who'd have thought?
God, it's a beautiful time to be alive.
So let's go ahead and start. The governor recently, this past week, announced a 30-day suspension of the sales tax on gasoline. By my guesstimation, it probably save a Hoosier about $8 a month and some change. So maybe that's a trip to Starbucks and two cups of coffee and a donut. Your thoughts on suspending the sales tax on gasoline?
Right. I mean, clearly he is appropriately worried about the cost of living. We're looking at an Iran war where I think the best projections are petroleum headed to $200 a barrel, which would be gasoline in the $7 to $8 range here in Indiana. And again, that's largely you can pinpoint what it should be. But what you can't pinpoint is how much people cut back on use that may dampen demand. So I wouldn't be surprised if we're seeing a resurgence in work from home in the coming months. And that's really dependent upon the state of the war in the Middle East, which is going sideways. And so the any sort of state level relief on that helps consumers. Of course, it doesn't help the roads any. It doesn't help the general fund any. And so the inflation affects not merely households, but also the people buying asphalt and providing government services. So this will eventually catch up to us. So, I'd expect we'll have another renewal of this, and I'll see this spread around much of the country as we deal with several months of fallout of ongoing war.
So, do you think Hoosiers will notice that suspension of the sales tax on gasoline? Because, like you said, it may suspend the sales tax on gasoline, but because of the crisis in the Persian Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz and oil being cut off from Iran, um, is it going to be eaten up by higher gas prices, though?
Oh, absolutely. No doubt about it. Already has. It was good to look at it happened and at a time when my tank was about a quarter tank. So I was able to fill it up, you know, 12 cents a gallon less than it would have been. The full cuts don't come into effect. Prices are downwardly sticky, and so that's all been erased and will be erased. If the ceasefire, the quasi ceasefire that we're in right now, doesn't hold, which I don't think anybody thinks we're going to see anything other than a resumption of hostilities. And to get, sort of the best case scenario is several months and much higher prices for petroleum as delivered. The worst case scenario is, many more months beyond that with a 20% reduction in shipments outside of the Persian Gulf as a consequence of, a variety of things that could be Iranians mining the Persian Gulf or closing the Straits of Hormuz with direct fire weapons. The really worst case is that the Iranians respond to their fuel being constrained as export by destroying the fuel capacity in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, and elsewhere. So it wouldn't be at all surprising if something like that emerged from this in the coming weeks. So we'll just have to see how the war plays out.
It's interesting, Mike. You bring this up because talk about sort of the psychological impact of high gas prices. I was in court this morning over in Hancock County. So as I'm driving back on I-70, you see the gas station signs like you always do. Regular gas for my car, 3.79, but diesel is like almost $6, and that was like, wow.
Right, and it's going to get worse. Again, all these are component parts to the petroleum that's produced here, West Texas Intermediate, which is produced in Texas, Oklahoma, and in the Dakotas. The Brent crude oil is the one that I look most closely to in Europe. That's driving the overall international cost. So the delivered price of that's about $150 a barrel. So we haven't seen that sort of price spike yet. We're seeing the dollar five per barrel effect right now. We're 4 to 5 weeks away from the $1.50 effect at the pump. So that's $6 plus per gallon. And then as it gets to 200, that runs us to 8. For diesel, it runs us over 10, $11 a gallon. And so you start thinking about what that does to the delivered price of the items in your Walmart, the fresh produce, those sorts of things. You start looking at diesel trains, the effect of those heavy fuel users. And then you start thinking about, what that does to consumers and how the demand is offset by those higher prices. So we're not going to be taking vacations like we did this summer. This summer, we're not going to take the vacations we did last summer. They're going to be closer to home, a lot more staycations, not building on to the house like we did during COVID because those prices are really high. And then when school resumes in the fall, we're going to find schools facing double transportation costs for fuel at a time when some of them are seeing 20, 30% reduction in their property tax budgets, which affect either school building operations, the heating, cooling, maintenance, water, electricity, sewer costs, or transportation of students. And so, I think we're going to see, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see if the war continues into summer, 4-day school weeks around much of the country, work from home being reintroduced, that sort of thing, just because schools are going to be really strapped to keep the air conditioning and heat on at full range and to transport kids to and from school. Indiana will be hardest hit, of course, because of the SEA1, but it's going to affect all of the country. So if you like the school disruptions of COVID, we're staring down some of those in the fall of this year.
Michael, it's interesting you bring it up because obviously you can't use social media these days for much of anything except to annoy people. But it's been funny, sort of the defenders of this are saying, high gas prices are a small price to pay in exchange for fill in the blank.
Right. So count me as a determined enemy of the regime of Iran. They have plagued my military experience throughout the 1980s and 1990s. I have friends who've been killed by the Iranian backed militia Hezbollah and elsewhere. Their crimes are too full-throated to discuss here. The world's a better off with their leaders mostly gone and dead. The question we have is how effectively can we make that happen? What are the tools at our disposal? And what are the costs that Americans are willing to pay? We were willing to pay fairly high gasoline prices and endure a recession to liberate Kuwait in 1990, 91. Prices have zoomed right past that. So I think Americans, properly understanding the circumstance and trusting the planning process of their national command authority are willing to endure an awful lot to make the world a safer, better, freer place. But I haven't heard that full-throated a defense of this operation in quite those words yet. So I think the best I've seen is like 17 different purposes for it. And so I just think it's good for Americans to realize that the war, it's very easy to understand what Iran's goals are, and that is to stay alive and impose the biggest pain they can on the people who've attacked them. And they don't have the weaponry to do so outside of closing the Straits of Hormuz and choking the global supply of oil. That's their only weapon that we have left them to use, other than stochastic terrorism, which could be unleashed at the end of, at any point they wish. And so it seems to me very easy to predict that their goal is to endure for months until you see, dramatic economic pain being felt by Europe, our allies in Europe, our long-term allies in Europe, the United States, and elsewhere, so that the political pressure against attacking Iran in the future is so enormous that nobody really takes it seriously. So that's the Iranian view. What the United States does, is a far more difficult proposition based on the concerns that I think the administration has over midterm elections and the enthusiasm that Americans greet this war, which is pretty low. I don't think
I guess
that's a bad
Michael
term.
Hicks.
Nobody's enthusiastic about war, and the acceptance of this war is pretty poor compared to the experiences I've seen in the past. And I would say that the men and women who are currently serving there are enduring pretty difficult conditions. You know, we've had a small loss of life so far, but the actual wound casualty rate of our forces there are orders of magnitude higher than it was in Desert Storm, for example, or Afghanistan. The wounding rate's been very high, and so without ground combat. So um, this is a grim affair, and I think it's just good for Americans who are thinking about it to think about what they're willing to sacrifice to see the end of this, and what they think the end of this might be politically palatable.
Our guest in the program today is our good friend Michael Hicks, professor of economics, Ball State University, talking about economics and sort of the state of the world. Mike, let's move a little bit closer to home. Property tax bills came in the mail this week. We looked at our property tax bill. It was basically a $20 increase over last year at this time. But on the flip side, that's how the whole story. We got almost like a $300 property tax credit, which is basically a dinner at Hyde Park Steakhouse for me and my wife on a good day. But that's about it. Any thoughts on property taxes and what was done and how this is going to impact Hoosiers?
I mean, that's pretty good on your $5 million estate to only have a $20 increase like that. Now, the it's to understand Senate Enrolled Act 1, Senate Bill 1 from last year. The best way to look at this is not through the political framework, but to look where the actual tax cuts came. And this was a ginormous business tax cut. It eliminated property tax. Property taxes entirely for about 85% of Hoosier businesses. Those that had a property tax between $85,000, which was the previous minimum threshold for reporting business personal property tax, up to $2 million. So it went from a plumber and an F Ford 250 and some tools and parts was exempt from paying business personal property tax, up to an Applebee's. And so about 85% of Hoosier businesses have less than $2 million in business personal property. So that tax revenue, that tax base went away. Biggest business tax cut on that part alone, I think, in state history. The second big piece was the elimination of the 30% floor on property taxes, which essentially means that whatever capital investment you make in a business, you're only going to pay taxes on that for 8 years. You can depreciate it fully over 8 years, and your tax liability goes away. So this was a breathtakingly large business tax cut that you got to provide some applause to the business lobby, particularly the chamber, for having done their homework and come in with this argument. I think the argument was wrong, but at least they did their homework. The people who got taxpayers who were not businesses, so households are residents. This is largely a symbolic tax cut that almost nobody will see. I've asked everybody I know about their property taxes, which isn't something you do easily, right? So just casually asked. Everybody's taxes have gone up, in part because most places, even in places that have not done well in attracting people, have seen home price valuation over the past couple of years. That's reversing. And so in the next couple of years, our assessed values in many places are going to drop and our tax burden will drop. But that extra $300 per family per year, which was about what you'd get if you had a $375,000 to $400,000 home. Most folks are paying more taxes this year, and the fact is that if the assessment and the movement up to the cap means that most households will not see any savings from that tax cut. The simulation didn't take into account the appreciation growth this year. So most people aren't going to see anything. The really huge losers, right? So the big winners were big businesses that had, hundreds of millions of dollars of 30% cap on their taxes around the country, around the state. The second big one were those small businesses up to about the size of an Applebee's or McDonald's franchise, who all their taxes are gone, which, by the way, is a great incentive to buy those automatic pay kiosks and automate all the labor that you possibly can because you're not paying taxes on it. So the fundamental calculus for hiring low-wage workers in those sectors is gone. So we'll see probably a big spike in automation. And then, the sort of people who didn't feel anything on the cut side were households, but local governments, libraries, schools, counties, municipal governments are being just slashed. Some are seeing, almost everybody is getting high single-digit tax revenue cuts, which are themselves as bad as anything that any local government's been through in the past, like 25, 30 years, really going back to the time we have data in the 1970s. In terms of personnel cuts, almost every school corporation is going to have to lay off instructional staff and teachers. My local school corporation is going to slash about a third of bus drivers. So kids are going to be on bus trips a much longer duration. Libraries are seeing, 10, 15, 20, 30% cut. So they're going to close branches. They're going to close hours. They're going to stop accession of books and services like ebooks and things like that. Police, there are a number of police departments around the state who are already, particularly in rural places, are ending their night patrols during the weekday. And we'll see fire departments struggling. Your insurance rates are likely to go up just because of manning issues. So really a very a tax cut that didn't make very deep considerations of the spillover effects of this sort of revenue shock.
Michael Hicks, a guest on the program today. Mike is a professor of economics at Ball State University, talking about Indiana's sort of fiscal shape and tax policy and the whole 9 yards. Mike, I got a question for you about the whole tax issue. I've always had this theory, and I've had this theory for a while, and I'd love to get your thoughts. Like I said, I only took a couple of economics classes in college, but that's about it. Everything else is all business law and politics. But my theory has always been is that people don't necessarily mind high taxes as long as they think they're getting their money's worth. If I'm paying for a lot, it's like going to a restaurant. I'm not going to pay Hyde Park Steakhouse prices for White Castle sliders. That's not going to happen. But I will pay the Hyde Park prices for a Hyde Park dinner. So my theory is it high taxes are the issue, or are people that just feel like they're not getting their money's worth is a problem?
Well, I mean, I think what you've just articulated is more than a theory. I think that's almost an iron law of taxation. And the way that you best know that is if you just look at like population growth or migration in the United States, if you go to social media, if you go to Fox News, you hear people are moving from high tax to low tax places. That's just not even true. On average, but for every one person that moves from a high tax to a low tax place, about four moving from low tax to high tax places. And so on average, there's a big migration and population growth happening in the higher tax places. And that, of course, is not because people like to pay taxes. It's because those are places that have the type of government services that attract people, good schools, low crime rates, well paved streets and walkable neighborhoods, and there are a million other things people like, but those are the things that you sort of observe. And so they're doing very well. And so I think a lot of it's hard for me to pin down an argument for the anti-tax hype, because if you really think about what happened with this was, the lieutenant governor in the summer of 2024 before the election pulled out a tax plan that had J.D. Prescott, in my office right at the edge of tears over how bad this was going to hurt his farm in Randolph County. Old JD, went along with the tax plan after the cuts to his farm were ironed out. But that tax plan went through 6 iterations over the weekend because essentially a couple of guys got down and, it looked like they were drinking beer to come up with the tax plan. I'm not sure they were, but it certainly had that effect. And it was
I would say
bad.
probably edibles and beer, my friend.
Right. It was certainly not adjudicated with somebody who was good at arithmetic and anyway, and familiar with the fundamentals of our tax system. And then something like that got taken to the General Assembly, they passed a first round, which was a tractable tax cut for households. Would not have really damaged local governments severely, but it was addressing some of the growth issues that I think most families have. I think most families look at their home value assessment, and they don't realize like that's probably lagging the market in most places. You can sell your home for more than you're being taxed on it, and so they have become accustomed to getting more public services than the for the tax dollars they're getting, and they think, oh, I'm a victim of inflation because I'm a family. They don't realize that, I mean, schools are far more, exposed to the ill effects of inflation across the board because it's all people cost and transportation costs and energy costs. And so if we haven't dealt very well with rising prices for energy, which we haven't, or we haven't, prevented the hospital monopolies from jacking up prices, schools are getting pummeled by inflation far more than my mom on Social Security, who's getting, like everybody else, Social Security increases that are about a percent or two higher than the inflation rate. And so I think the political motivation behind this wasn't a sober assessment of the quality public services that they get. It was led by a small but vocal cohort of people who are just very they don't want taxes. They don't like government. They don't care about local schools because their kids are out of those schools. And those are the sort of people that have a table in the public policy debate, but shouldn't be the loudest voices. The loudest voices should be people who actually have public services they can enumerate their value. But those people are generally raising families. They have jobs. They're busy. It's us, it's retired folks who can come to these meetings and often do. And I think that was a very ill effect. And my comment to them is, do you want an Indiana that saves you $20 a year on property taxes, or do you want an Indiana that has communities that could bring your grandchildren back from Texas or Virginia or California, where so many of them have left?
And it's funny, also, whenever I hear someone talk about property taxes and why should I pay for schools? My kids don't go to school anymore, blah, blah, blah. So I'm paying for something I don't use. Like, well, technically, while that may be true, but the land benefits from the service from the good schools in your community. It's the schools, it's the roads, it's all the other things that contribute to your quality of life that make your home as valuable as it is. So when you sell your home, you can actually make a little bit of money off it and move somewhere else, as opposed to being in a bad neighborhood with bad roads, bad schools, bad cops, bad everything.
Well, you're 100% right, but the way I would say it, the people who voted against or voted for pushed these property tax cuts. They don't care about local schools. They're disinterested in the performance of local schools. They, for some reason, don't think the local police departments matter to them. They're not worried about the potholes, the street conditions in general. The property taxes for the largest share don't go to road maintenance. They don't care about those things. They've already articulated that in their vote choice, right? What they were pushing for. And so why would they care about a higher valued home to leave to their grandkids if they've already said these are things that I don't care about from my grandkids? Because I guarantee you, your 23-year-old granddaughter who's raising, has a newborn and a toddler who's looking at schools, they care an awful lot about, is the neighborhood safe? Are their schools solid? Is the state going to ensure that my kids are ready after high school to go to college, and that there's a college available for them that's well funded so they can have a career? And that's not what Indiana is making a priority. And so the folks who are pushing for property tax cuts don't care about that. So I'd assume they don't care if their home increases in value because to be left to their children or grandchildren, because they've already taken part in eviscerating the public services that young people are voting with their feet to take access to. So as a guy with an empty nester with my youngest now about to graduate from college here in Indiana, everyone's fled. They're fleeing they don't see big economic futures in the state. They're doing very well elsewhere. But I think my friends around the state are seeing the same thing. Kids mostly leaving for greener fields elsewhere. And I think that more than $20 on your property taxes ought to be the acute public policy concern that faces all of us.
So, in other words, what you're saying is, when it comes to taxes and services, it's like my mother used to say, everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die.
Precisely. And just what I'll say is the assumption that economists make about households and businesses is that they use every bit of information available to them about their decision making. And they don't take time to learn everything, because learning something is costly. But they look at communities, they judge them as best they can, and they move there. And when they look at a home, they don't just look at the home and go, "Oh, this is cheap, I want to move here." Because if that were the case, people would be moving to South Muncie, where you can get a number of 3,000 square foot wood frame homes for $30,000 folding cash for many Americans. They're moving like crazy to Fishers and Noblesville and Carmel and Zionsville and Shelbyville and Plainfield, because they want access to the public services that are there, the neighborhoods, the schools, and that's what they're really looking for. And so for legislators to treat households like they're unidimensional, dimensional morons, that they only care about tax rates, they don't care about quality public services, is shocking to me. And I think, I think part of it comes from the think tank world that just bombards legislators with misinformation about this. And I have a number of friends in that environment, including a number of people who used to be at Heritage and AEI and Brookings and elsewhere. But I think at the end of the day, voters have got to they got to be electing legislators who view them as actually sentient adults who can judge school quality along with tax rates and treat them accordingly. And the best way to do that is to let local governments make those decisions, because they're the ones that would have to eat the mistakes or can bask in the glory of success. And the state taking control away from local governments means they've got to be better at crafting legislation that works for Lake County and Fayette County, which is virtually impossible.
Our guest in the program today is our good friend Michael Hicks, economist at Ball State University, talk about a number of different economic issues, whether it's sales taxes on gasoline, property taxes, the whole nine yard. Mike, a couple of things as we get into the home stretch of our conversation. The governor announced this week $200 million for childcare development fund to make childcare vouchers more affordable for kids, kind of maybe sort of reduce waiting lists. Good investment, bad investment, short-sighted investment, or what do you think?
So we actually published a childcare study 2 years ago, and just it's important to frame the issue of childcare subsidies. If your family earns like more than $57,000, you don't get the subsidy, $58,000. So they're for fairly poor families that are not poor but middle class or lower class families on income, who are looking to have a spouse re-enter the labor force with children. So if you're a mom and you have two kids and you want to enter the labor force, it takes about $26 an hour, which would bump you out of the subsidy range. With subsidies, you could maybe $22, $23 an hour, which if you have a spouse making a little bit more than that, that bumps you out of the subsidy range. So for you, those $22 to $26 an hour are sort of the range that you could take childcare and have take-home pay equal to minimum wage, right? So to afford childcare in a fully loaded package, and your go to work, your salary bring you home, take home pay equivalent to minimum wage, you're going to be making $27 or as much as 35, depending on the benefit package. And so most families who choose not to work and to stay home with and not engage in childcare are doing so with the intelligent, the capacity to make decisions about what's in their best interest. And so the subsidies that the governor has reintroduced were actually pulled out of childcare facilities last year with the budget. So last spring, he pulled that $200 million of subsidies, which, should affect somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 families or kids, a smaller number of families. That caused child care providers around the state to go out of business. So a big chunk of them have gone out of business this year. So around here in Muncie and elsewhere, people who provided subsidized voucher childcare are now, many of them gone out of business. And the employer community that hires 15, 17, $20 an hour workers who is now feeling the dual pain of the end of childcare subsidies, which probably cost a fairly big share of female labor force participation, and mostly it's women who are staying at home with kids, and the end of legal and illegal immigration means that those businesses who are hiring 15, 16, 17, 18, 22, $23 an hour, which are sort of the minimum threshold for a one just to be making any take-home pay from a job for somebody who's also paying for childcare, they are screaming like crazy to the governor. And so the extra $200 million, I think, is going to allow more childcare facilities to reopen if they're willing to do so in this policy seesaw environment that we have. But I think it's that some smaller share of households are going to re-enter the labor market. And I think in the next couple of years, you're going to see employers, even with the pending downturn because of fuel prices, I think you're going to see a lot of angst over the ability to hire people at 15, 17, 18, $20 an hour because they're just not willing to leave home and give up taking care of their children for the very low wages that those jobs offer.
Mike, as we get ready to wind down our conversation here, uh, I'm thinking about the old movie 9 to 5. Dolly Parton, Lily Tomlin, Jane Fonda, and at the end of the movie, they brought the childcare facility actually into the job place. So a woman or a secretary could bring her kids to work. The kids be taken care of. She'd go to work and not have to worry about childcare. Is that an idea or a thought that's been brought here in Indiana?
Well, yeah. I've heard several legislators talk about it. The Suzanne Crouch talked about it in her campaign for governor. Um, and the pathway to do this is that there are a number of businesses who would love to do that. They would love to open a child care facility, but the regulatory environment is very difficult for opening one. They would have to hire a number of people. So for the schedule for supervision, which I don't think we want to change, is you got one child care provider for 3 infants or 2 infants, and then it goes up till when you're in 8th grade or older, or 8 years old or older, you can have one person for essentially a small classroom size. That and all the training requirements and the security requirements and all that accompany it make these fairly expensive, not just to open and operate, but to insure. And so a lot of large employers around the state who would love to have done this, they did it in World War II like crazy, right? Would be happy to hire people to operate it. They would provide the facilities, they would build it, but insuring it, providing security for it, and that sort of thing is a very difficult ordeal. So the state can deal with some of that, but I don't think they can solve all the problems. But yeah, I think at some point we are now at a position of shrinking labor supply in Indiana. And that's going to continue until immigration returns. And so the available workers are going to become more valuable. Businesses are going to have to either figure out how to pay them more, automate more of those work. The things you can't really automate very easily are taking care of children. And so that's going to be a growing share of our economy. We're just going to have to accept that's the way the world works, and either provide ways to keep people in the labor market in so doing, or accept that they're going to be gone. There's no middle position in that. So, I mean, we would be smart to have a lot better educated workers. Young women are going to school at pretty high rates. We could boost that even more. They would be more young workers who had the means to hire childcare. But right now, we're doing the opposite. We're building a cadre of low-wage workers across the state. So I think our childcare problems are going to become more acute over time, not less acute. And that's pretty much what we could have said, uh, 8 months ago or a year ago when the governor eliminated this program last year.
I got about 90 seconds left, Michael. So overall, looking at our discussion today, how would you sum up Indiana's financial situation?
Right, we're entering probably a global recession, and so Indiana has fiscally pretty good insulation from that. We have a large rainy day fund, but we have structural problems in our underlying taxes, particularly property tax, that's going to really hamper the ability of local governments to do what they need to do to remain places that can attract families. And so, in some ways, very healthy in the pure balance sheet, but in the bigger problem of how good are we doing as government in making places that people want to live, we're not hanging where we need to be in that. And I think it's going to become acutely obvious over the next few years.
Or maybe in the next couple of weeks when the primary hits. So we'll see what happens, my friend.
Yes.
Our guest on the program today has been our good friend Michael Hicks, Ball State University, covered a number of issues on the program today, whether the sales tax on gasoline suspension, property taxes, school fund, the whole 9 yards. So, Mike, my friend, always good to chat with you. We'll probably visit you once again in midsummer to see if we turn into Road Warrior.
Not that bad, but we're certainly looking at some tough times. Thank you very much.
Actually, I take that back. Mad Max Beyond the Thunderdome.
There we go. That's it.
Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.